So let my life be the proof of your love. Let my love look like you and what you made of.
Okay, so you're going to be turning to Matthew 18. Matthew 18. We're going to see about finishing, and this is a very, very tough verses. I have to tell you right up front, it's tough. It's about building relationships and doing what is right, and this whole topic of forgiveness. Man, once I start going through it, you'll see what I mean. This forgiveness is not easy. It's quite complex. And this is what Jesus deals with in this passage. Forgiveness. Forgiveness is what we need to build relationships, right? Why? Because, moral failure is universal. Everybody sins. And everybody needs forgiveness. We need forgiveness, and those that sin against us need forgiveness. And it's hard work. People would rather go get drunk. People would rather go and get distracted by whatever distractions, or work at numbing the soul because it hurts, right? It's hard work. And it's easier to argue about things that really are not as important, but sometimes we feel like, I'm an expert at that. I can argue that. And off we go. And in 1 Timothy chapter 1, by way of introduction, we'll eventually get to Matthew 18. But in 1 Timothy chapter 1, the Apostle Paul is writing to Timothy on how to run the church, basically. And he says in verse 3, 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3, as I urge you upon my departure for Macedonia, remain on at Ephesus, so that you may instruct certain men not to teach strange doctrines, not to pay attention to myths and endless genealogies, which give rise to mere speculation rather than furthering the administration of God, which is by faith. But our goal, and here it is, but the goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. To help somebody with that, oh my goodness. I'd rather argue about climate. I'd rather argue about homosexuality. And not that those things are, but are we really with sincere faith? Pure hearts, clear conscience? That takes a lot of work, right? With one another. We can think of all kinds of people that have hurt us, or we've hurt them, and we don't want to face them, and here we go, right? It's difficult. So, how many people do you know who are willing to do the hard work of building good relationships? And in these days, young people, right, bounce from one relationship to another, because it's easier than stick and work through things and forgive one another. It's hard. And in Matthew 18, you already know by now, right? Matthew 18, Jesus has been training his disciples. He was rejected as king, and so now he focuses on the disciples. And his disciples been learning. And then somebody asked Peter, hey, does your master pay tax? I guess he does. Yes, he does, but for the right reason. And so then the disciples come to him and they're like, well, if the king has to pay taxes, but then who's great in the kingdom of God? Right? That's what he comes in chapter 18, verse 1. The disciples then are like, Jesus had to pay tax? Then who's great then? And so he began to teach them, it's good that you want to be great. It's very good. He didn't condemn them for wanting to be important and great. No, that's not a longing in the heart. That's the way God made us, right? He told Adam and Eve, rule the world. Like, whoa. He made us to be great. And so they come to him like, I'm confused. You're the king and you pay tax? So Jesus began to teach them, well, you want to be great in the kingdom of heaven? It's not what you think how the world says you're going to be great. It's going to be very opposite. And one of the things he began to say is like, well, you want to be great, then work at building and restoring relationships. It's hard work. In fact, it's so hard that it took Jesus' life to reconcile us with God. That's how hard it is. Well, then, with that, and Jesus gave instruction, look, man, somebody sins, you go tell them, you confront them by themselves. They listen to you, great, you've won your brother, you've really gained what's truly valuable, but if he doesn't listen, take 2 or 3, that every word may be confirmed. He doesn't listen, take it to the church. Doesn't listen to the church, then you treat him as a non-believer who's rejected. You excommunicate. Like, wow. So then Peter comes around, and we start now in verse 21. And remember, this is Jesus telling them, you want to be great? Here's how to be great. You go and confront to restore relationships. When somebody has sinned, you go and do all this process. But that's hard. So then Peter thinks like, well, okay, I want to be great. So let me go to Jesus. And at that time, the rabbis, those that scholarly, they said, look, you need to be able to forgive 3 times. 3 times, man, that's a lot. So Peter says, okay, I'm going to double it plus 1. And so this is where we begin, right? This is where we begin. So look at Matthew 18, verse 21. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? Remember, the rabbi said 3 times. He doubled it plus 1. 7 times he was being like, man, I'm going to be good. Jesus said to him, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but 70 times 7. So then he gives them a parable. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he had begun to settle them, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. But since he did not have the means to repay, his Lord commanded him to be sold along with his wife and children and all that he had, and repayment be made. So the slave fell to the ground and prostrated himself before him, saying, have patience with me, and I will repay you everything. And the Lord of that slave felt compassion and released him and forgave him the debt. Note, forgave him the debt. Right? Take note of that. Underline it. Take note because it's going to come back. Forgave him his debt. Verse 28. But that slave went out and found one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. And he seized him and began to choke him, saying, pay back what you owe. So his fellow slave fell down to the ground, began to pleading with him, saying, have patience with me, and I will repay you. But he was unwilling, and went and threw him in prison until he should pay back what he owed. So his fellow slaves saw what had happened. They were deeply grieved and came and reported to their Lord all that had happened. Then summoning him, his Lord said to him, you wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have also had mercy on your fellow slave in the same way that I had mercy on you? And his Lord, moved with anger, handed him over to the torturers until he should repay all that was owed him, my heavenly Father will also do the same to you if each of you does not forgive his brother from your heart. This passage is very, very pregnant, like 9.5 months pregnant. I mean, this is just, and I have to confess that my thoughts are not as organized. So you're going to get a lot of information and you're going to be confused. I'll tell you right now. I don't know, but it's just a lot here. Okay, a lot. So let me look back again. There's the impossibility of what Jesus is saying. Peter came and said, like, 7 times, that ought to be like way over what's required. And Jesus multiplies that by 10. No, more than 10, right? 70 times 7. It's impossible. Yeah. Because it's an eternal debt. When he says, in verse 24, look at this. In verse 24, it says what? And when he had begun to settle, one was who owed him 10,000 talents. The measurement there was a heavy measurement to weigh precious metals, like gold and silver. 10,000 of that. In today's economy, it would be billions, not thousands, not millions, billions. That's what he owed. Never could ever pay it. That's how much he owed. It's an impossibility. It's an eternal debt. And that God forgives them. God forgives them, right? And then you have the community getting involved, right? The community, his fellow slaves got involved. And then we have to look carefully at the basis of forgiveness, right? On what basis? And again, I'm just telling you right up front, it's going to be a lot. So maybe, write down your notes and later you reorganize it to where you can understand it. So Peter was a typical human being who wants to know exactly what to do. Right? Give me a list. Give me a list. 7 times, I'll do it. But it's not so much the number of times so that I can accomplish it. It's a matter of being something. It's not a matter of lists so I can check them off. No, it's a matter of being. So if I say, well, you need to forgive, okay, 10 times. Okay, I forgive. Go down to 10 times, like, I got it done. No. It's about being forgiving. Being. Having a heart that's forgiving. It's not a number of times. But Peter was a typical you and me. Give me a list. I can do it. No, you need to be forgiving. A heart of forgiveness. And it's 70 times 7. It's a way of being, a mode of living, a characteristic way of living. 70 times 7. Always forgiving. That's the point. Always forgiving. Okay. So that's the being of forgiveness. And that's an impossibility for us humans. We can't do it. But that's what Jesus is saying. You need to be always forgiving from the heart. Because again, they were brought to him and it was impossible. Okay, sell him, sell his wife, sell his children, and all that he has, and put him to prison because that's not enough. That's not enough. That's how much he owed. Right? And I want you to note, because really this is a parable about a king, a forgiving king that did not forgive. He was a forgiving king that did not forgive. At the end, did he not say, hey, throw him in prison? Right? That's what it says. So he was a forgiving king, but forgiveness didn't actually take place. I told you. There it is. I'm not making it up. So let's work at understanding what's going on here. There is a kingdom of heaven, an unseen rule over the earth. Right? So it is, it says, verse 23, for this reason, the kingdom of heaven, it's unseen, but it's here. And not only is there a kingdom of heaven here and now, there's also a king. There's also a king. We don't see him, but there is a king. Right? And by the way, the issue of forgiveness many times is non-physical. Right? And I'll talk more a little bit about that. But there's a king and a kingdom unseen. But everyone owes the king. Why? We know from the scriptures, the king is the creator and owner of everything. The owner and creator of everything and everyone. So guess what? When we fail the king, when we don't honor the king, we are in debt to the king. I mean, right off, those words are very important. Because we live life as if there is no kingdom and there's no king. It's about me. This is my happiness, my fulfillment, my efforts. No, there needs to be a correction of that, because when we correct that, then we're able to say, oh my goodness, have I been forgiven a tons. If we don't understand that, forgiveness is like, pew, way out there. And so, there is a day of reckoning, because there is a kingdom and there is a king, and he is our king, our savior, our Lord. There is a day of reckoning. So, and as I said already in verse 24, it was billions of dollars in today's economy that he owed. It was an eternal amount, right? The man was to be sold, verse 25, along with his wife and children and all his possessions. Point. It was impossible for him to pay everything that he owed. Right? It was impossible. Notice, I want you to notice something, because this is very important in forgiveness. This is very important in forgiveness. Notice that the king was holding the debtor responsible. Was he not? Sell him. Sell his wife, sell his children, and all that he has. He needs to be held responsible. It's very important. Because many times we say, well, you got to forgive. But they won't even talk to me. No, it doesn't matter. You got to forgive. You're like, so you don't have to hold him responsible? For real forgiveness to take place, the debtor has to be held responsible. In fact, the debtor knew. How do I know that he knew that he was being held responsible? He fell to the ground and began to beg. He was being held responsible. So in the issue of forgiveness, so you need to forgive somebody. Somebody else needs to forgive you. Whatever what the offense was needs to be held and say, this is what the deal is here. Otherwise, forgiveness is cheap. It's not really the real thing. All right? And I'll talk more about that. But I want you to note here, the offender was being held responsible. So that's what we have. Right? And so now we get to verse 26. So the slave fell down to the ground, prostrating himself before him, saying, have patience with me, and I will repay everything. Have patience. What's patience? In the Old and New Testament, patience means God or whoever has the right to judge me right now. But patience says, I'm not going to judge you immediately. Even though I have the full right to judge you now, I'm going to be patient with you. And that's what the slave was saying. Please be patient with me. Don't judge me right now. I'll pay you everything. But it was impossible. It was impossible. So now you see the meaning, why it's very meaningful when we say in verse 27, and the Lord of that slave felt compassion, pity, and released him and forgave him the debt. He was begging, he was on the floor, and the Lord knew he couldn't pay. So he felt for him because there seemed to be a brokenness there, right? And by the way, first of all, verse 27, we find the meaning of forgiveness, the definition of forgiveness. In verse 27, what's the definition of forgiveness? Letting go of a legitimate debt, of a real debt. He let go of the debt, right? So, listen, forgiveness means that there is a sacrifice made. You owe me a Cadillac. You really, legitimately, you owe me a Cadillac. I'm going to release you. I'm going to lose that Cadillac. Ugh. So when forgiveness takes place, if you need to forgive someone, know that you are sacrificing. And if somebody needs to forgive you, there needs to be an acknowledgement that you owe and that you know, man, they're releasing me from that debt. Forgiveness is defined right there. Right? Forgave him the debt. Seeing the hopeless and helplessness of the condition of the slave, the king had pity, compassion on him, acted graciously, kindly towards the debtor. I want you to know too, listen, if forgiveness is going to take place, both the offender and the offended need to allow themselves to be impacted by the sin. Here, the offender was moved by compassion. He was impacted. Why do I say that? Because many times it's like, oh, they sin against me. Hey, I forgive you. Don't worry about it. And they're not allowed themselves to hurt. There's not real forgiveness there. Or the offender, here. I'll give you this, I'll give you that, I'll give you this. Just forgive me. They're not really allowing themselves to be impacted by the sin. Here, the king was moved. He allowed himself to be impacted. In fact, again, what happened towards the end? In verse 34, when that slave was unforgiving of his fellow slave, the Lord was moved with anger. It impacted him. And it's very important where true forgiveness takes place, that there needs to be allow both the offender and the offended need to be, allow themselves to be moved, hurt, impacted by the sin. And when we take into account our debt towards God, it's eternal. It's eternal. So, man, all we can do is gain appreciation, a deeper appreciation for the forgiveness we have in Jesus Christ. If we're honest, if we're seeing honestly our sin, right? And we can't say, well, they're sinning too and they're sinning too. No. It's against the King Almighty. It's up against the King Almighty. So we will never run out of reasons why to appreciate the cross. We will always have reason to appreciate the cross. Always. Right? And so this is our condition. But it's hard to live by that reality. We quickly go off and forget about the profound forgiveness we have received in Jesus. We quickly do that, right? And then we start pointing fingers or complaining because we forget. This is the common human condition. We all do that. We all do that. I do that. We all do that, right? And so what this forgiven man did, what did he do? It's right there in the parable, right? Verse 28. But that slave went out and found one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii, comparison to 10,000 talents, billions and billions of dollars. 100 denarii was 100 days of labor. A denarii was usually paid to a soldier for every day. A day of work, 1 denarius. So here, 100 denarii, 100 days of work, of labor. That's what this fellow slave owed him. So, 100 denarii, and he seized him and began to choke him, saying, "Pay back what you owe." I was forgiven billions and billions of dollars, but you owe me 100 days of work. Pay back right now. What did that show? What did that show about how broken he was over how much he owed the Lord? It was fake, right? It was fake. So, he found a fellow slave and began to choke him. Wow. Verse 29. So now, the community gets involved, right? It's not just the offender and offended. Now the community gets involved. In verse 29. For his fellow slaves fell to the ground and began to plead with him, saying, "Have patience with me, and I will repay you." But he was unwilling, and he threw him into the prison until he should pay back what he owed. So when his fellow slaves, you see that? Fellow slaves. And his fellow slave said what? The same thing that that first one had said to the Lord. Be patient with me, right? I will repay you. And he fell down. He did the very same thing. He acknowledged that he owed him. He acknowledged, right? But instead of having compassion, he threw his fellow slave into prison until he should pay. The other fellow slaves came and said, wait a minute. They got involved. They didn't say, well, that's not my problem. Somebody else. No. They got involved. The community got involved. And notice, what does it say about the community? They didn't just go and, man, hey, did you see? Did you know? And go tattletale. No. They were affected. Is not that not what it says there? In verse 31, look what it says. And when his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were deeply grieved and came and reported to the Lord what all had happened. They were deeply grieved. They were moved by it. You see? It's not just about gossip. It's really caring. If there's going to be forgiveness, we need to be moved and really care. You see? They were deeply moved. They reported the unforgiving heart of the slave that had been forgiven so much. Was it just the person, the fellow slave that was hurt? No. All the other fellow slaves were hurt too. When you and I sin, it's not just this one little thing. No. It affects many others. Many others. We don't live unto ourselves. You see. If one of my children brings evil into the house, it's not just them. It affects the whole family. Right? And in the church, when there is something of evil, immorality, it affects the whole church, even though people may not see it, but it affects them, right? And all this is very, very important to see the need for forgiveness and what's forgiveness all about. You see? Because there is a day of reckoning. When the fellow slaves were moved, they were hurt too. They went and told the Lord. And so now, the Lord, the king, he was called a king in the beginning, verse 23, now he's called Lord, confronted the unforgiving slave. The Lord starts by calling the slave wicked, which is the judgment of what the slave is. Then the Lord points out the forgiveness that slaves had received, that slave had received of the entire debt. Then finally, the Lord points out the forgiveness had been granted at the mere asking. That's all in verse 32, right? Then he summoned him. His Lord said to him, "You wicked slave, I forgave you the debt because you pleaded with me." Simply because you pleaded with me. Is your fellow slave not pleading with you? So really verse 33, this should be the consequence. This should be the basis for us forgiving. Right? You need to forgive someone? The basis needs to be verse 33. Should you not also have had mercy on your slave in the same way I had mercy with you? But you see, if you and I do not appreciate the profound, eternal forgiveness of God, then forgiveness is going to be like, yeah, I'm supposed to forgive. And they're supposed to forgive me. Kind of like flippant about it. No. Shouldn't you have forgiven the way I forgave you, man? Here's the basis of forgiveness. The character of God. His mercy. That should be the basis. So now, in verse 34, it got worse for him, right? He owed him billions and billions of dollars. It could have just, be sold and be thrown in prison. But now it got worse for him. Why do I say that? Because look at verse 34. And his Lord, moved with anger, handed him over to the torturers. To the torturers. Until he should repay all that was owed him. Wow. Wow. By the way, in verse 27, remember I told you, underline that, be sure to note it, right? Look at verse 27. And the Lord of that slave felt compassion and released him and forgave him the debt. And now he takes it back. Wait a minute. I thought that was forgive and forget. Not here. Sorry, that doesn't work. Wow. Wow. I'm not making it up, guys. You look at me like, that's true? Huh? Verse 27. And then verse 34. Ain't no forgive and forget. What happened? The brokenness wasn't real. If it was real, it would have been showing in the way he treats his fellow slave. The truth came out. You see? Do you see what I mean? That forgiveness is not that simple. I mean, there it is. So, am I forgiving? Am I forgiving? Well, it shows up in the way I treat others. Right? Do I hold grudges? I can remember my wife and I having some pretty dandy intense fights. Do I hold that against her now? If I do, maybe I haven't appreciated the great forgiveness I had in Jesus Christ. Being handed over to the torturers now. And again, the Lord was moved by the sin, right? He was moved. There needs to be genuine forgiveness, then there needs to be impact of the harm done. And once again, it's just amazing what's happening here. And so if we say, verse 35, my heavenly Father will also do the same to you if each one of you does not forgive his brother from the heart. How are we going to get that heart of forgiveness? Right here is when we appreciate the forgiveness we have from Christ. You see? When we have the forgiveness of Christ, it begins to change our character. It begins to really change us profoundly. So that then when we're offended, yes, we're going to be impacted. We're going to get hurt. Of course we're going to get hurt. But we release that debt. We release that debt. Now, so the forgiveness here is based on the character of God, right? His mercy, his forgiving heart. That's where it's based on. So it's not a matter of just, hey, I forgive 7 times or 70 times 7. No, it's a character thing. That the character is, he's forgiving. She's forgiving. That doesn't mean that forgiveness is going to take place. That's what we have here. He's a forgiving king, but doesn't end up forgiving. You see? Because we have a forgiving heart doesn't mean forgiveness is going to take place. I told you, this is not easy. It's complex. And let me just say a couple more things that make it even more complicated. Ready? Here, the debt is very clear to see, right? Money. That's the debt. And there's many physical things. You owe me money, you owe me a meal, you owe me all, you took away that gun, you owe me that gun. You said you were going to pay me, you haven't paid me. You owe me this dress, this clothing, this whatever, physical things. But listen, there's many, many things that are non-financial. It can be things like this. Exclusivity. What do I mean by that? In a marriage, forsaking all others, exclusive you. And when there isn't exclusivity, we have a debt. The husband or the wife has a debt. Between husband and wife, there should be exclusivity, fidelity, no other. Unfaithfulness, that's what it is. How about protection and security? Parents are supposed to protect and have their children secure, but many times there's all kinds of abuse from the parents. There's a debt, massive debt by the parents. Provisions. The parents are supposed to provide, and yet there's so many that are neglected. The parents are in debt. How about respect? The Bible says the wife is to respect the husband. When the wife disrespects the husband, there is a debt that the wife owes. The husband is supposed to love his wife, and when the husband does not love the wife, loves something else or someone else, he owes a major debt to his wife. Major debt. Unfairness may be demonstrated as favoritism in a family. No. You see, the debt can be so many non-physical things, right? And we have a debt to others, and others have a debt to us. And, what happens? What are the dynamics when sin occurs and we owe a debt? What actually happens? Well, if I take a knife and cut your arm, what has actually happened? What has actually happened is I have violated boundaries, right? There's skin, there's muscle, and if I cut across, I violate those boundaries. And those violations of boundaries can be non-physical. Non-physical, right? That's why, very clear illustration, in a marriage, when there's unfaithfulness, there's been a violation of boundaries, right? And they can occur in many different ways, not just that, right? But it's basically a violation of boundaries. And what happens when there's a violation of a boundary? If I take a knife and I cut your arm, ouch! Right? It hurts. There's pain. That's why in relationship, when there's violation of boundaries, people hurt. People get hurt. It's non-physical, but it's real. It's real. And by the way, the offended get hurt, but the offender also gets hurt. Even though they may not feel it immediately, they get hurt. Take an instance like pornography. We owe God holiness. We owe God holiness and faithfulness. Pornography violates that. God is grieved and the person has poison in his soul. It hurts both the offender and the offended. The offender may not feel it immediately. In fact, the offender may feel good about it. But no. And then, when such violations are not dealt with properly, what happens? Infection. If I again take a knife, cut you in your arm, it hurts, there's blood all over the place, and if it's not dealt properly, what? Infection. Then if that's not dealt properly, gangrene. And if that's not dealt properly, amputation. And so it is with violation with sins. And that's why the need for forgiveness is so massive, right? And many times these violations are not dealt with. And here's another thing about all this. Listen. Again, the illustration, if I take a knife and I cut you, and all of a sudden, I am so broken about what I have done. And you acknowledge that I violated you. And because you have received mercy, you forgive me. You really forgive me. And I'm all broken and I receive the forgiveness. Does that mean that the cut is just gone? No. The cut is still there. And it's going to be painful. And it's going to take time to heal. And many times that's why, well, I thought you'd forgiven me. How come you're not happy anymore? How come you're mad with me? It's like, it hurts. And again, we don't get all that. There's the issue of broken trust. I go back again to the illustration. I take a knife, I cut your arm, and I'm broken. You feel the pain. You see, we both see, you forgive me. And okay, are you going to get close to me? Probably not. Are you going to cut me again? In other words, trust is broken. And trust is one of those things that, man, if there's no trust in a relationship, it is miserable. Miserable if there's no trust in the relationship. But when there is trust, oh my goodness, it's just so wonderful. It's just great, And here's the other thing about trust. It is so easy to break trust. It is so easy to break trust. Oh my goodness. And here's another thing about trust. Thought you had it all right. Trust takes a long time to build. It takes a consistent, steady, godly behavior to gain a tiny little bit of ounce of trust. So when there's been legitimate, real forgiveness, that doesn't mean everything's solved right away. No. Don't expect all the good effects of forgiveness to take place right away. So forgiveness is a release of a debt. Forgiveness also, when the king was holding this person accountable, right? In verse 25, he was holding him accountable. Sell him, sell his wife, sell his children. In a way, listen to this. In a way, the king was upholding that person's dignity. He was upholding that person's dignity. You are a moral, responsible person. And to hold you with dignity, I'm going to hold you responsible. You see? All of that is involved in trying to forgive really genuinely. Holding the person responsible means you holding them, their dignity in place, right? Here's another thing about forgiveness. Because we know we have this availability of forgiveness through Jesus Christ doesn't mean that we can demand it. No. When we demand forgiveness, there's no real brokenness. There's no real brokenness. When we have sin and we say, man, I don't deserve forgiveness. All I can clean on is your mercy. You have mercy on me. Yeah. Then, we must, here's the first application. Because, really, believers are to really be forgiving because of what they've received, the forgiveness they've had from the Lord. They need to have that in their heart, in their very character, in their being. It's not just, okay, I forgive you 3 times. No, to have a forgiving heart. Whether forgiveness takes place or not depends on all these other measures, right? We must be forgiving. And that means that we must be willing to lose something, right? We must be willing to lose something. Because whatever is owed to us, we need to say, I'm going to let it go. I'm going to let it go. I'm going to release it. I'm going to forgive it. Why? Because these are the means of gaining relationship. You see? We forgive for the purpose of gaining relationship, number 1. Number 2, and the biggest reason is we get to represent God in forgiving, really forgiving. We get to represent God. So we must be willing to lose something, forgive a debt, in order to gain a relationship. So you and I need to be ready to let go of some things, to lose some things. Let go of a debt for the purpose of gaining relationship. So when you think of forgiveness, you're like, I need to be ready to sacrifice. I need to be ready to sacrifice. That's the first application. Second application, we must forgive from the heart. It must be the very character, right? Why? Because if we don't, it goes into infection. And by the way, emotional, spiritual infections can take years to manifest the infection. A physical infection, a doctor, Nate, can tell you pretty quick, shows up. But some of these non-physical violations and infections, sometimes 30, 40 years before they finally show up. That's why it's like, oh, Lord, help me. Help me. We must be forgiving from the heart. It's an impossibility unless we turn to the Lord and see how much forgiveness He's given us and accept that forgiveness so that then we can have a forgiving heart, right? And having a forgiving heart doesn't mean that forgiveness actually takes place. This was a forgiving king, but forgiveness didn't take place, right? So finally, the last application is verse 35, really, of Matthew 18. You want to be great? You want to be great? Disciples, apostles, you want to be great? Believers, you want to be great? Commit to representing God by both holding people accountable for their sins, but having a forgiving heart. Be ready to hold people accountable for their sins, at the same time having a forgiving heart. That's representing God. Representing God. Because I say sometimes we think of cheap forgiveness, right? You offend me, okay, I forgive you, don't worry about it. You're not letting the impact of the violation. And if you sin, you want to deal with it quickly and not really deal with it. Just come on, I'll give you whatever you want. Just forgive me. And not really be broken. No, God sees right through the whole thing. God sees through the whole thing. there's other things to say, but I see that I've confused you enough.
So let my